All right, everybody. Hi, and thank you for joining us for our Tech Talk. Toby Goodlock is one of our solution architects here at Mirantis, and he will be presenting Kubernetes at the point of sale for you today. So, Toby, take it away.
So as Brittany mentioned, my name is Toby Goodlock, and I'm a solution architect here at Mirantis. So first, our little disclaimer. Everything we say here is under my discretion. This is not necessarily Mirantis views and products, or this is how I am choosing to convey everything that we're going to cover in our presentation today. So today we'll go over a couple different main points. The first one being, how do you achieve responsiveness in your architecture independent of how it's set up? Basically, how do you make your systems more responsive? Second point is, why has Kubernetes become the de facto orchestration solution? There are other ones out there, but they're not as well known and not as widely adapted or adopted as Kubernetes. We'll also go over some of the migration options you have for your legacy or existing monolithic workloads, whatever term you want to use for those. And then how do you stay up to date with this new world of cloud native architecture, cloud native technology? What can help businesses stay relevant in today's current cloud world? So first, I want to take a look at some graphics. This survey was sent out to multiple companies from the CNCF, and this is Kubernetes global adoption as of 2022. So at that point, more than 60% of respondents had already adopted Kubernetes into their environments and are working with it on a daily basis. Another 30% said that by the end of 2023, they plan to implement Kubernetes in some form or fashion, which leaves 9% of those unsure about what they're going to do. So based on these numbers, by the time we end calendar year 2023, we should see over 90% of businesses that were part of this survey have adopted Kubernetes. It's being adopted extremely quickly across multiple industries and verticals because of the benefits it brings, not just from a business level, but from an overall corporate level. Now, what are some of the top Kubernetes workloads for 2022? Obviously, the top one here isn't really going to be a big surprise. You've got open source observability. Pretty much every single Kubernetes cluster or environment that's created needs some sort of observability for your logging, your monitoring, your alerting, things like this. And the best tools for this typically come from open source, things like Grafana, Kibana, Prometheus, names we've probably heard of, but don't know exactly what they do necessarily. Then you've got offerings like databases, which take up, as of 2021, we're at about 48% of the workloads. In 2022, that added another 48% and went up to almost just over 70% of workloads that were identified. You can see messaging below that, CI/CD platforms, and then you have a couple of other pieces. Now, keep in mind, these are the most common workloads across all Kubernetes clusters. So based on the industry and the vertical that a business may be in, some of these are more relevant than others. Now, let's talk about a specific use case with Adidas or Adidas, depending on where you're from and how you pronounce it. So in 2017, Adidas decided to move to Kubernetes, and they did this in a very aggressive fashion. Within just 6 months after kicking off their project, 100% of their e-com site was running on Kubernetes. Now, this is 5 years ago, and it only took them 6 months to get up to running all of their e-commerce site on Kubernetes. They reduced the load time for this site by half. Releases went from once every 4 to 6 weeks to multiple times a day. And with about 4,000 pods, 200 nodes, and 80,000 builds per month, they're running almost half of their most critical and impactful systems on a cloud-native platform. The visual here shows that with no cloud-native support in 2022, Adidas was doing about 40 million euros worth of business just on their e-commerce site. By moving that to the cloud and adopting cloud-native technologies, within 8 years, they went up to 4 billion euros. So that's 100x growth over 8 years by simplifying and improving the process they use to move into the cloud. One of the things, in my opinion, that sparked the biggest change and adoption in Kubernetes, specifically on the retail side in the past few years, was COVID. If we look at how retailers typically function, you have foot traffic, where you have people visiting your website. And this is what brings in a lot of your revenue. Now, when COVID hit and the entire planet essentially went into lockdown, foot traffic for retailers nearly bottomed out. It dropped almost 98% across the board. Obviously, if people can't leave their houses, they're not going to go out to be able to buy things at retail stores. So in order for retailers to stay relevant to their customers, they need to be able to reach them through different channels. One of these was the storefront, but now you have e-commerce, you have mobile apps, you have multiple ways of reaching your customers. And by adopting an orchestration technology such as Kubernetes, you can respond much faster to changes in the market. So what we have seen historically over the past few years is that the retailers who were able to take advantage of this technology and move fastest, be able to respond to their customers quickest and to trends in the market faster, are the ones who are having the most success moving to a Kubernetes-based environment. One of the challenges with this, though, is that most providers of point-of-sale software are still working on moving into containerized or Kubernetes-based workloads. So while there are ways to get around this, it's not necessarily the best plan initially. This is typically what we call a lift and shift. You're taking what you have right now and you're simply picking it up and moving it to a different environment, whether that's a public cloud or you're building your own private cloud or even a hybrid model. Oops, sorry, wrong slide. So a couple of the things that I'm going to show you now, these are actual products that Mirantis has that can help not just retailers, but any vertical, any customer set up their Kubernetes footprint, understand it faster, and get into operations without having to go through all the technical overhead of truly understanding the depths of Kubernetes, because it is a very complex environment and it's growing more so every day. One of the things that you may have heard is that by default, Kubernetes is not secure. This isn't a misstatement. Kubernetes wasn't built from the ground up necessarily to be secure. It was grown to be extensible. Security is part of being built into that extensibility model. So as Kubernetes ecosystem grows, there are more and more solutions to make it more secure. Depending on the provider you go with and how you implement that, you could be secure from the get-go. But with changes in technology, you always have to make sure that you stay secure and keep ahead of some of these trends. So what I'll switch over to now is I will take a look at one of the Mirantis products called our Container Cloud. And what this allows us to do is this is a UI for essentially creating and launching Kubernetes clusters across any provider. So whether you're looking to do this on-prem, in the cloud, or a combination of both, you can use this same UI to create your clusters, and you have a lot of functionality and flexibility built into it as well. So within Mirantis Container Cloud, we have our UI here. And let me go over what's included in this UI so we can kind of understand actually what it is that we're looking at. On the left-hand side, I have laid out all of my hierarchies. So this ICM pre-sales team, this is the project that I'm part of. You can think of a project as something that you're working on right now. It could be multiple workloads or it could be a single one, depending on how you want to configure this. Now, within the project, we have multiple clusters. So every user who has access to this project can see all of the clusters that are created here. And not just the clusters, but in the central panel, we have a lot of information right off the bat about what's happening in our clusters. We can see what provider they've been created on, from AWS to OpenStack to Azure to VM or bare metal. You can create on all of these. We can also see the status of the cluster. Some of these are not ready because they're still being created. Some are ready and they're fully functional. And some are actually updating because they may have the auto update feature turned on. We can also see in the releases here, with this circle arrow and the green icon, this cluster is available for an upgrade. There's a newer version available that can be deployed to this cluster. We can see how many managers and workers we have overall in this entire cluster and how long it's been stood up. Now, because some of these clusters are available for upgrade, we can do this in one simple step by clicking the upgrade button. Where this provides end users a lot of benefits is if you're deploying environments. especially if you're deploying multiple environments, or in the case of some retailers, maybe you have things like a pop-up store. There's a big event coming up, and you obviously can't set up an entire physical location there, but you can create a pop-up store. This is extremely easy to do by simply creating a new cluster and then importing the data that you need for that store. Once the need for it is done, you can tear it down and you're good to go. So within the clusters, this is really a two-step process of creating a cluster. And when you do that, you'll give it a name, pick which provider you want, and then go through all the information to create your cluster. Once you have that shell created, now you go ahead and add the nodes. So if we go into the Toby TechTalk cluster here, or TechTalk Toby, we can see that I have 5 machines pending. Now I started this 20 minutes ago, as we can see by the age. And so what I'm waiting on right now is actually the cloud provider, in this case, AWS, to finish provisioning all of these virtual resources that I need for my cluster. Where is this different and maybe better than doing this directly in AWS? Where this is different is I have access to the VM instances themselves. But not only that, this is also creating all the networking I need in place. This is deploying by default a logging, monitoring, and alerting bundle that we have created so that you as an end user or as a company don't have to spend a lot of time taking these open source pieces and putting them together in order to make a functional logging, monitoring, and alerting solution. We can also see what types of nodes we have here. By default, we recommend a minimum of 3 manager nodes so that you have high availability, and then as many worker nodes as you want. And that's really as simple as it is to create a cluster through Container Cloud. So then you just wait for the resources to be provisioned, and at that point, you're able to start deploying workloads onto your clusters. One of the big things that we keep in mind here as well is removing end user obstacles. If you have to click a button more than twice, you're doing it one time too many. So really what we're taking away from this is that command line interaction level, where it's really easy to accidentally type in the wrong character. And by doing that in environments such as these, it can have huge ramifications. So now as an end user, I'm really just confirming what I see and what I want to do. The options are pre-chose for me. And so there's very little risk that I'm going to put something in incorrectly. Now, once we have our cluster stood up and running, another tool that we have at our disposal here is called Lens. You may have heard of this tool before, but this really allows you to, after you use Container Cloud to create and maintain and do lifecycle management on your clusters, what if you need to interact with them? What if you currently have a container that's running, but it keeps throwing errors and you need a way to be able to troubleshoot this? Lens is a really good solution, probably one of the best on the market right now, to be able to go in and access your clusters from a troubleshooting or management standpoint. Now, where Container Cloud will allow us to create clusters across multiple providers, Lens takes that even a step further. We can incorporate clusters from cloud provider specific offerings, such as EKS, AKS, or GKE, depending on which one you use. So now what I'll do is I'll jump over to Lens and we'll take a look at that. I actually have one of my clusters here, this KNG KubeCon demo, available in Lens, so we can really see what's happening there. So from here, I've created my cluster, I've brought it up, and it's ready to be running. Now, if I go into Lens, this is the default view in Lens of my cluster. So before this, I would use something like kubectl or another command line tool to interact with everything that I'm doing. For me personally, I'm a very visual person. So if I can see what's happening as opposed to reading what's happening, it has a lot more impact for me. One of the things we can see here on this screen is we have our favorites bar within Lens. So this red, yellow, green icons, just chosen arbitrarily, are some of my favorites clusters, ones that I'm going to connect to on different times. You can see if it has this little blue dot here, that I'm connected to it in the background. But what I can also do within my clusters, I can get very specific information about what's happening. I can look at my specific nodes. that are connected to this cluster. I can see what roles they have. All these same things I could do through the command line, but this really simplifies and condenses the view that you have to the different parts of your cluster. Now, one of the other things that we like to do is make sure that your developers are able to focus on what they need to focus on, which is writing code, not maintaining or managing infrastructure or waiting for infrastructure to be provisioned, because all that does is slow everybody down. So one of the things that we do to make that easier is we have several offerings that allow developers to do just that. We will take care of the operations, you take care of the applications. So your business is able to see value faster on returning investment on the things that actually matter to you as a company. So some of the other things that we're able to do is Lens has this concept of spaces. This is similar to what we saw in Container Cloud, but this is only within Lens itself. So what this allows us to do is if I go up to the top and I switch to my Mirantis pre-sales space and I click on the blue button for the catalog, now I can see clusters that other people within this space have added. And so I could potentially connect to those depending on my access levels within this space. This is a really easy way for collaboration within teams. And one of the biggest benefits here is I don't have to have a local kube config file to be able to connect to my clusters. What this means is I've now eliminated a huge security risk because anyone who has access to that kube config file can get directly into my clusters at an administrative level. Now, by making people members of this space that I'm sharing, they don't need that type of file. There is a secure connection in the background, allowing them to actually connect to the clusters that are here without needing that kube config file. Now, if a user changes teams and you simply need to move them to another shared space, you can do that as well. And their access is updated automatically. So if we go back and look at our cluster that we have running here, not only can we see the nodes that are in it, we can see an overview of what's happening here. And Lens is highly extensible. One of the things, all these little icons that are loading here, this is actually a Lens extension called Resource Mapper. And this allows you to see all of your resources in a cluster and how they're connected. Now, this one is a fairly large, almost production scale cluster. But as a developer, if I was running this on a local cluster or one that's been provisioned that I can load my workloads onto, it would be much smaller. And I can check and make sure, okay, the application I deployed, is it connected to the storage, if any, that it needs? Does it have network connectivity? Is it able to do everything I expect this application to be able to do? And by adopting cloud native technology, we're able to respond faster. So coming from a grocery background, one of the things I used to think about was when a grocer would send out their promotions for the week, everything that's going on sale for that week in their grocery store. They'll send out the price changes, those take effect, and then the promotion itself runs. Now that may be a week or 2 weeks, and then at the end of that, the retailer is able to take that data and see how well the promotion went. That was good when we had all that time to respond. But now, as quickly as things move, those users and those retailers need that data now. So by having access to the data now, they're able to pivot and move much faster to stay relevant to their customers and in the industry that they're in. As we saw with the Adidas example, their deployment time for their builds went from 4 to 6 weeks to multiple times a day. They are able to maneuver so much faster than companies who have yet to adopt this kind of technology because of the benefits it brings. We can even go in further and we can see all of our namespaces. We can see all the pods that we have running. So really with Lens, I can drill down as far as I need to. I can go into an individual pod and see what containers are running in it, shell into that, get logs from it. There's really no limit to what you're able to do with this. So with these two UI capabilities, you're able to, one, with Mirantis Container Cloud, create, manage, and have that lifecycle management ability within all of your clusters. And with Lens, you can connect to new clusters, existing clusters, as long as it's a CNCF certified Kubernetes distribution, Lens can connect to it and give you that visibility into it. Now, one of the things I mentioned earlier is we're trying to get away from command line, but we also know how important that is and how relevant that is to a lot of people. So within Lens, you have the ability to do a command line session from here. So now this would be as if I'm connected to this cluster from my command line outside of Lens. And I can do something like kubectl, get PO, and it will list all the pods that I have running. Now it only listed this one because it's looking in the default namespace. So if we want to verify that, we can switch to just default. And sure enough, we only have one pod running in that default namespace. But now I get a lot more information up here about what is happening with this pod. How long is it up? What is its status? How was it deployed? Is it controlled by a replica set, by a deployment, something else? Has this pod been restarted? And this is extremely important as well. How many containers are in this pod? Because as we know within Kubernetes, a pod is the smallest level of orchestration, but a pod can have multiple containers. So if we go back to all of our namespaces, we can see here, this one has 2 out of the 3 it's expecting to be run. Now, some of these are jobs, so we don't expect those to be running anymore. But this is the visibility you're able to get into your environments. And again, from a retail or Kubernetes at the point of sale perspective, I can get extremely granular about what I'm looking at. Not just what I'm looking at a corporate level, but down to the store level and down to the individual POS. Now, when I started the conversation today, I mentioned that this has applications across multiple verticals. Really, what we're looking at here is the ability to make an individual end user, whether that's a person or a point of sale solution or whatever it may be, extensible all the way to the edge. So we're taking the edge and extending it further to an individual end user with ways to manage this, monitor this, and do troubleshooting all remotely or however you need to do it. Thank you for your time today. That is really all I have to say in this talk about how Kubernetes at the point of sale can be beneficial and has applications across multiple industries and multiple verticals. Thank you for your time today. I'm Toby Goodlock.